Hello, this is Larry Medsker. I'm the chair of the ACM U.S. Technology Policy Committee, and I'm happy that you are joining us today for one of our hot topic webinars, and it's absolutely a hot topic. We'll be talking today about the use, control, and the legality of lethal and other autonomous weapon systems. We have a panel of experts that will be very interesting for you to hear, and there'll be a point where you can contribute your questions and be part of the discussion. So on the next slide, I want to just give some housekeeping points. There we go. So we're recording the event today, and it'll be archived for public view. Your microphones are muted, but you can contribute questions, and please use the Q&A button to contribute your questions. And if they're chosen, given the time we have, I'll pose those to our panel. Okay, so let me look at the next slide. Wanted to tell a little bit about the ACM Technology Policy Council. I mentioned that I'm chair of U.S. Technology Policy Committee. Under the council, we have the Europe Technology Policy Committee and also the Tech Briefs Committee. You can learn more about our work at the website here. And also joining our efforts is easy. You can send email to acmpo@acm.org. Okay, next slide. A little bit about the Technology Policy Council. The mission is to inform the computing community and the general public about the impact of computing advances in today's connected world. Also provide independent, nonpartisan, technology-neutral research and resources. This is really important, we think, for policy leaders and the public to get an unbiased view of the technology of today. Then the other part of the mission is to leverage this resource of scientific research and practices and deliver science-based analysis of the technologies that we're encountering on a daily basis. Okay, next slide. One of the products of the Technology Policy Council is Tech Briefs, as I mentioned. The most recent one that I was involved in too is automated vehicles. Then there's one on safer algorithmic systems and generative AI. These come out quarterly, and just to give an idea, there are 4 pages of statement of the problem and the policy impacts, and then a very concise summary of the treatment of the technology itself with lots of references. Okay, so as that's the preliminary information I wanted to share with you. And so let me introduce the panel for today's Hot Topics. So Professor Ronald Arkin is Adam, is there a different slide there?
Bear with me, I'm not quite sure what the problem is, but there's always something. Back to you shortly.
Well, I'll go ahead and give a little bit of background for our panelists, and then they're going to have opening statements and maybe add a little bit to what I'm saying. So Professor Arkin is a Regents Professor Emeritus in the College of Computing at Georgia Tech. Professor Gary Korn is the director of the Technology Law and Security Program at American University. Senator Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan is serving most recently as the inaugural director of the U.S. DoD Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. And Jody Westby is the vice chair of ACM Technology Policy Committee. And we designed this Hot Topics seminar, webinar, and she had the lead in that, so I want to acknowledge that. And then, of course, we met with our panelists to finish the details of what we're going to do today. So again, welcome. I'm so happy you're joining us, and we're going to make this conversational, so a format where our panelists can discuss among themselves and with you the really important issues of today for this topic. So I thought we'd start with opening statements from each of our panelists, so we get to know each other a little better and kind of find out their perspective on this topic. So, Ron, would you like to start?
Sure, Larry, I'll be glad to. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's been busy times the last few weeks even on this particular topic. I was at the University of Pennsylvania where they held a meeting entitled Ethical and Legal Dilemmas of Autonomous Weapons in War and National Security. The DARPA has just closed a round of proposals for the DARPA Asimov program, which is concerned with integrating standards and ideals and autonomy with military operational values. There was an URSA program a little bit before that for urban research, urban reconnaissance and situational awareness, addressing some of the issues surrounding this technology. And last week, I was at an Air Force Scientific Research and Army Research Lab meeting on testing and evaluation of ethical AI workshop. It's a hot topic, I guess is the best way to describe it. So what is going on in this area? Well, the military has been for some time very much interested in this technology for a variety of reasons, including force multiplication, which involves a reduction of the number of soldiers needed, expanding the battle space where you could conduct combat over larger areas, extending the warfighter's reach, and reducing friendly casualties. Now, that's not the reason I've been engaged in this community. My concern is understanding how we can use AI and robotics for reducing ethical infractions in this. And it used to be there wasn't a whole lot being done, but it is now. My goal in any research in this space is to find better ways to reduce non-combatant casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. And I've been working in that space as a robot ethicist now. I've been a roboticist for 40 years and a robot ethicist for maybe 20. And understanding the reasons for ethical autonomy and the reasons against ethical autonomy as come forward with my discussions with NGOs and others. I do believe that lethal autonomy is inevitable, largely because it's already present in the battle space and has been for some time, depending on your definitions. And I'm going to hold off on those definitions to, I think, our first question as well, too. I am an advocate to some degree of an ethical principle called the precautionary principle, which emphasizes caution and pausing and reviewing technology before leaping into new innovations. There are those that argue against it because it tends to stifle innovation as well. So there's a tension, I don't know if it's a healthy tension or not, between those two. And much of my focus has been on understanding the plight of the non-combatants that are trapped, as you can see, in Gaza and elsewhere in the battle space. And the numbers of civilian casualties is utterly unconscionable for that. I do believe AI and technology can help, and I also believe that it's our responsibility as scientists to look for ways, effective ways to reduce man's inhumanity to man through technology. What better place than in the battlefield where it is increasingly evident? And with that, I will stop.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're really looking forward to going into those ideas. Gary, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. That was a fantastic, I think, initial laydown that Ronald gave. It is a hot topic. It is a sort of hard topic to penetrate for most people, present company included. It's a complex technology that raises lots of questions. I will say I come at this, presently I am the director of the program you mentioned at the Washington College of Law, but I retired from the Army in 2019 after 30 years, almost 27, practicing as a military attorney. I had the good fortune back in the 2010, 2012 timeframe to first get to know General Shanahan in his capacity at the time on the Joint Staff when I was advising as a deputy counsel to the chairman, and started looking at some of these technology issues. And then I spent 5 years as the senior lawyer for U.S. Cyber Command in my last assignment. It's interesting. There are a lot of parallels in terms of every new technology that comes on the scene for military application causes lots of questions. It ought to. But I think there's always a big gap between myth and reality in those discussions and in driving policy thinking and otherwise. And so I think that's certainly the case right now. And it sort of bogs down some of these discussions, as Ronald alluded to, just basic definitional questions about what is autonomy, what is artificial intelligence, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a capability, or we're talking about something that is a form of compute power introduced into existing military capabilities or weapon systems, et cetera. And just what are the implications of that? Does that necessarily mean that it can't be used in compliance with legal, moral, and ethical obligations, or does it mean that it actually can enhance some of those obligations or help commanders? The last thing I'll say on that point is, we'll get into it. My experience has been certainly within the U.S. military. Let me say that there's not an interest in developing capabilities that would further risks to civilian harm in the conduct of operations. And generally, the capabilities that will make our operations against legitimate enemy forces more effective tend to actually have the incidental impact of minimizing civilian harm. The more we have precision munitions, the more we have the deeper ability to identify with greater accuracy military targets and adhere to the obligation of distinction from civilian targets. That is consistent with military logic and effective operations. And so you get that separate benefit. But sometimes that's not always the case in the capability that you develop, and that's what we have to interrogate with this.
Great. Thank you. You mentioned the misinformation, and this is it's an important area as well. For we'll be doing a tech brief on that one of these days soon, on misinformation and disinformation. But it applies to so many areas, but certainly to the one we're talking about today. So then you mentioned Jack. So would you like to go next? And
yeah, thanks. And really a pleasure to join my fellow panelists here and make it very, very clear up front that everything I say, of course, is not reflecting the official position of the United States Department of Defense. I am retired, 36 years retired from the United States Air Force, and a very operational background, beginning in fighter aviation and then in intelligence, in policy, in command and control, to include commanding it at 6 different levels in my 36-year career, where, on one end, as a tactical operator in fighter aviation, was employing weapons at that front end, and then sending people into harm's way as a commander over and over again. And I also had the experience of seeing the fallibility of humans in conflict. So my final 5 years in uniform, which are most relevant for this conversation, was one standing up Project Maven, which was an AI project designed to bring AI capabilities to the exploitation of full motion video from ISR platforms, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And then from there, I then stood up the Department of Defense Joint AI Center, also known as the JAIC, or now CDAO, the Chief Digital and AI Office, which is my final assignment before I retired in the summer of 2020. So I guess to sort of cut to the chase on what the things I'll be talking about, not surprisingly, be very operationally oriented. I guess what I would offer is, I'm a little frustrated at times by the people that assume with no further evidence that the US military and other militaries will always do the wrong thing before they do the right thing. What I would like to submit is that the existing procedures and processes and policies we have in place for every weapon system will still apply to autonomous weapon systems and to AI-enabled autonomy. And just to sort of segue from what Gary was saying, there's a lot that is the same. I think what we really want to focus on is what is most different about these systems, because at least as these systems stand today, they don't act that much differently from any other systems I've dealt with in my entire career, but they're going to get there. To Ron's point, there is an inevitability part of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And I think we have to understand that. And then the goal should be for all militaries is the safe, lawful, and ethical use of AI-enabled military systems. So that's my going in argument. I will offer the case that there is a way to do this, not to dismiss even those cases where I disagree with the assumptions that this is the worst case scenario, and this is what the US DoD will do with AI-enabled lethal autonomous weapon systems. I never dismiss those, even when I disagree. On the other hand, I also think we need to take into account the very near-term challenges with these capabilities. So in the middle of these is what I think is the realistic viewpoint that I will come back to with what I call a 5-tier risk framework for AI-enabled military systems, but we'll talk about that later. So thanks.
Well, that's wonderful. Yeah. Jody, would you like to finish up with them?
Yes, thank you all for joining. So I guess I'm here to provide the bark for this program. I have my 3 dogs corralled up here with me, but I have a workman that just came in the house. So if you hear a little noise, that's what's going to come out of my side. I primarily looked at this space from a thought leadership perspective. In 2002, I coined the term geo-cyber stability and began looking at global cyber stability. And of course, that brought into play issues of warfare. And in 2003, through my role with World Federation of Scientists, then co-authored the report toward a universal order of cyber stability. And then in 2010, participated in a program at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences at the Vatican on this topic of including artificial weapons or autonomous weapons in the laws of armed conflict. And in 2011, co-authored and edited the United Nations publication Quest for Cyber Peace. And then in 2021, participated in NATO's 2040 strategic approach exercise in looking at the issue of autonomous weapons and robotic soldiers in an Indo-Asia Pacific context. So my work has primarily come from the thought leadership and writing perspectives. It combines technical, operational, legal issues, which I am always attracted to, multidisciplinary issues, and also then I've always been attracted to international legal frameworks. And I think this is an area of the international legal framework that is so important, especially because it dovetails so clearly with technology, creates such an important intersection for humanity and for nation states. And it's one that's quite unsettled and complex. And it's in part complex because autonomous weapons, our notion of them, innovation of them is changing all the time. So I have typically looked at customary international law, the laws of armed conflict, other international treaties and discussions on this issue, and also looked at what is the United States doing. So my perspective will come a little bit multidisciplinary, but more in line with Gary on taking a legal perspective.
Okay, thank you so much. And what a wonderful panel. So we thought we'd start out with some basics about what is an autonomous weapon. So I think Jack will start out, and then others can join in whenever you want, whenever you feel it's appropriate.
As anybody who's been involved in discussions internationally and nationally on artificial intelligence and autonomy, which I think is everybody on this call today. You know the challenges with definitions. I mean, when you get to how phrases like appropriate level of human judgment or meaningful human control get interpreted differently, it explains why we've had been such lack of progress in certain areas of the Geneva group on government experts on certain conventional weapons. However, what I would say on a more positive note, when it comes weapon system, it seems to me the agreement is coming closer and closer together. And so what I was going to offer are two definitions, one from the US side and one actually is an interesting Chinese definition as well. So I'm taking the definition of an autonomous weapon system from Department of Defense Directive 3000.09, which is titled Autonomy and Weapon System. The reason I picked this one is because it is the one I'm extremely familiar with, but also because it is today, as I continue to say, the only document I can point of that is unclassified, publicly available with a definition and a description of a policy on how the Department of Defense will deal with autonomy in weapon system. So the definition is pretty straightforward. A weapon system that, once activated, can select and engage targets without further intervention by an operator. This includes, but is not limited to, operator-supervised autonomous weapon systems that are designed to allow operators to override operation of the weapon system, but can select and engage targets without further operator input after activation. That second sentence is actually very interesting. You could have stopped by just the first one, but they wanted to bring another piece of this in where it's a little bit more expansive. And I'm involved in these Track 2 AI dialogues. For those who aren't familiar with Track 2 dialogues, they're unofficial, non-government dialogues between states. Many times, if not almost every time, the people participating have been in the government in one way or another, but it is an unofficial. And the Chinese came to the table with two definitions of autonomous weapon system. The first is from the ICRC, so I'm not going to repeat that. The second one came out of something called Military Digest, which is a Chinese military-sponsored publication, which I think when I say these words, you'll find that it doesn't vary a lot from the US definition. So an autonomous weapon system typically denotes a category of intelligent robotic weaponry capable of selecting and striking targets independently once activated without further human intervention. At the heart of AWS lies the robot's autonomous capabilities to discern targets and employ lethality. And the last thing I'll say is that discern may be a translation issue, an interpretation issue. It's an interesting one to me. I might see things a little bit differently between the US definition and the Chinese definition, but overall, I would say those definitions are fairly close, if not very close, and match most of the other international definitions that I've seen. So I'll leave it at there, and I think Ron was going to take it.
Sure, I'll be glad to add to the confusion, I guess, that exists with definitions. As an ethicist now as well, too, I can speak to the fact that I've been spending time with a lot of philosophers as well. And an autonomous system to a philosopher implies something fundamentally different than an autonomous system to a roboticist, or even to a military person in this context as well, too. What that does, the confusion that arises from that is philosophers talk about not only sentience, but moral agency. In other words, the system might have responsibility before it's autonomous, or the notion of free will. Most, if not all, roboticists are not worried about that at this particular point in time, and probably not into the not too near future. Others have been concerned with theological descriptions and the like as well, too. But I'm focusing, and I think we are in this panel, focusing on more the technical side of things. We conducted a survey in 2008 under Army Research Office funding of the general public and others as well, too, military people. And the definition that we used, which predates 3000.09 as well, was that an autonomous robot is a robot that does not require direct human involvement, except for high-level mission tasking. Such a robot can make its own decisions consistent with its mission without requiring direct human authorization, especially regarding the use of lethal force. The results of that survey are online. The general public was a little unnerved by the notion of autonomous robots, partly fostered by science fiction, I like the Terminator movies as much as anybody likes the Terminator movies, but I'm pretty sure nobody's interested in creating robots, at least no sane people, on creating robots that are out to destroy all of humanity. Now, whether we build appropriate safeguards into those things is a secondary question, but there's more near-term questions, which I'm deeply concerned with. But the debate that's gone on at the United Nations for the last 18 years, I think it has been mired in definitional problems. And it's very hard to create policy, international policy, until you can come to agreement in what it is that you're trying to regulate. I am a strong advocate for regulation of this technology. I'm not sure exactly what the most appropriate venue is for doing that. And I do encourage pacifists who are interested in many NGOs, for example, in banning the technology in its entirety to find ways to prevent war from occurring. I personally am not optimistic about that, given all of human history, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. My concern right now is with what's called jus in bello, which is how war is conducted. And with the introduction of this technology, the potential for dramatic increases in civilian casualties or potential for dramatic reduction in civilian casualties exists. We need to regulate that. And to do so, we need to agree at least on definitions at some point.
Gary, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to add to all that. I think, you know, I agree. There's been a lack of consensus on definitions. Even, and I find it interesting, the different approaches, as you know, Ronald said, from a philosopher's perspective, et cetera. There's an interesting dynamic that is happening in these conversations, I think, which is the almost inexorable pull toward thinking about the technology generally as something sentient, right? And then the concerns about transferring human sentience and decision making to a non-human sentient entity, but we're not there yet. And so I think to some of the earlier points, I guess you can talk about a gradation between automatic and autonomous, but we have had for long periods of time weapon systems that are triggered by sensors, whether you think about a tripwire or landmines or, you know, so there's no immediate or direct human decision making in that other than the decision to employ it under certain conditions. How much different are we on a, you know, a sort of spectrum or path is part of the question. But when we generally in these, you know, discussions and conversations, if we sort of infuse the notion of sentience into the technology, it almost stops the conversations right there. Because if you take some of those definitions that Ronald gave, I think that it pretty much excludes any of the capabilities that are available today. Now, it may come in the future, but that definition would be, as I say, sort of excluding most of the technology that we're thinking about right now or have incorporated to this point in different weapon systems. And so how is it different, to General Shanahan's earlier point? I think you have to kind of baseline on definitions to figure out what is different either today or really thinking about how we should set the conditions for the future for what will be different.
You mentioned landmines, and I've been monitoring the question and answer place, and we've had 2 or 3 people asking about, you know, how do they fit in our definition of autonomous, and maybe you feel like we've covered that enough, but I just wanted you to know that our listeners or participants did ask about that.
I would like to add that in 1939 World's Fair, a toaster was considered a robot at that point in time because it senses and it acted and it was programmable by a little dial that was on the front. Thermostats and the like as well too. I've long argued that landmines, anti-personnel landmines, which are considered illegal according to the Ottawa Accords, which I still don't believe we've signed yet, correct me if I'm wrong on that, and other anti-tank and fire and forget systems as well too, which already exist, should and could be considered autonomous systems by most definitions. But I don't believe that sentience is a part of the definition that we should be using, or moral agency or free will. Those are, I'll leave that for the philosophers for right now.
You know, definitions are always hard. We spent a lot of time, all countries did, after 9/11, trying to define terrorism at the United Nations. To me, when I look at this issue, it's more important to me that we separate what is a soldier from an autonomous weapon. And in the laws of armed conflict, if a soldier, the question goes to, well, is it a lawful combatant? But if it's a weapon, then is it a weapon that could be an instrument of unnecessary harm and suffering? So this conversation does get bogged down by extreme examples, and it also is one that is difficult for many people to agree on. But I think if you look at it from the context of what is a weapon versus a soldier, and maybe define what is a soldier, in the laws of armed conflict, they're referred to as a person. But, you know, robotic soldiers to me are the biggest threat, because China could make 1 million of them, put them in a warehouse. They don't have to eat. They don't have to sleep. They get broken. You just put another one in. And I don't think that's how we really want to be having our troops fighting machines. The interesting thing, Jack, on Directive 3000.09 is that although it's entitled Autonomous Weapons Artificial Intelligence, that it exempts those autonomous or semi-autonomous weapons with cyberspace capabilities. And I think that's confusing. It's hard to determine, well, what are those with cyberspace capabilities, because so many of them does have some connectivity. But in the definition, it is very important, I think, that as we look at this, we look at what would be a soldier versus what would be a weapon. And if it's a weapon, then looking at the unnecessary harm and destruction, because so much of that goes to the principles of necessity and proportionality, but also to the protection of civilians and how our networks are really supporting civilian life today.
So let me just jump in on Joni on the point about the cyber. And what I would offer, whether or not exactly the best answer or not, is the cyber capabilities are covered in other, at least speaking for the United States, the Department of Defense, are covered in a variety of other ways, to include rules of engagement. As Gary and I know very well, working on those was a very arduous task back in the 2011 time period. We never quite got across the finish line, because there's so much involved in understanding what you're allowed to do in defensive and offensive cyber. But there is already so much out there on the policies and procedures that govern the use of cyber in the Department of Defense and in the U.S. intelligence community, that those don't need their own separate category in 3000.09. And I think this comes down to what you're allowed to do, when you're allowed to do it. Those are governed by lots of other things. They're just not given attention at 3000.09 for that very reason.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to that. That's absolutely true. And I worked through this extensively for my 5 years at Cyber Command. There are layers of control mechanisms with respect to using cyber capabilities. And, you know, frequently, you know, there's a dividing line between capabilities and weapon systems as well. And the directive is focused more on weapon systems. So in most instances, cyber capabilities would not constitute weapons, notwithstanding a lot of, you know, again, popular mythology. And I'd also say I for one, I don't see much confusion between what are soldiers and what are means and methods of warfare, which is what we're talking about, which are the things, the means or the things that soldiers use to conduct those in bello operations, and the methods are the tactics that are employed. That's been, you know, well baked into the law of armed conflict since the beginning. And, you know, I think if we were able to go back and interview some of the first soldiers that saw the first tanks coming at them across a battlefield, they'd understand that there was suddenly a very asymmetric disadvantage they were facing because machines, again, had been introduced as a technology into the battle space. But the machines were a means of warfare. They weren't the people that are well defined, I think, in the law of armed conflict.
Okay, well, thanks for that. And we've mentioned the role of AI, but that was another. Is there any more that anyone would like to say about that? I imagine there is. And we have some questions along the lines of AI and bias and so on. So would anybody like to, maybe Ron, would you like to say more about, or maybe summarize what you think about the AI role?
AI is a promise and a peril, and I've published that and others have as well too. But let's talk about this in context of lethal autonomous weapon systems in particular, which it seems where we're focusing. To be candid, cybersecurity actually scares me more than lethal autonomous weapons, with the potential for warranting a kinetic response, and what's the breakpoint for that. But that's a different topic for you folks to talk about. But the reasons for ethical autonomy are manifold. The ability to act conservatively. These systems do not have to worry about self-defense or their own lives. They can act in a way in which no human being would ever in their right mind. They may contain better sensors equipped for battlefield observations than humans currently possess. We can leave out, as I believe as the general mentioned, his understanding of how warfighters fail as well as succeed. They can be designed without emotions that cloud their judgment or result in anger and frustration. There are certain human psychological problems, one in particular, scenario fulfillment, which has contributed to the downing of a US airliner in 1988. And they can potentially, because of their speed, integrate more information faster from many different places than our slow-working wetware possibly can, even when enhanced by additional technology. And the other thing that's important is they can independently and objectively monitor the ethical behavior of the battlefield of all parties. That means both friendlies as well as opponents as well too, which may be concerning to some, because it breaks the band of brothers effect as well too. But the arguments that I've heard against it, which I can respond to, but I'm not going to do them all, I'll just list some of them now. The issue of responsibility, there's a so-called responsibility gap. Who's to blame when things go wrong? These systems will not be perfect. They will make mistakes. Then the question is, who is responsible, or who in both the singular and plural sense? Some have argued that it may lower the threshold of entry into war and lead to destabilization, violating jus ad bellum, the just war theory pertaining to entry into war. Some argued that risk-free warfare exists. I don't believe that, but it can be viewed as potentially unjust. Some just say it can't be done right. It's too hard for machines to discriminate. That's not the benchmark that I would use. I would use the benchmark that not perfection, but can we do it better than human warfighters can? And I suspect we may be able to do so. This is an untested hypothesis to this particular point, but I'm seeing creeping significant movement, is better than creeping, towards the actual testing of that hypothesis before too long. The effect on squad cohesion, robots running amok, the sorry, Dave, I can't do that effect of refusing an order from a human commander, overrides in the wrong hands, third-party non-state actors having control over these systems, the ability to strip out software, for example, that may be put into them to inhibit legal, moral, or ethical effects, the notion of proliferation, the winning of hearts and minds, and again, the use post-bello effects after war is over. And one of the great proliferation, of course, and the last one is one that is to the credit of our human warfighters, who are very creative in doing things with new technology that they were not designed to do. It's called mission creep. And I think we have to be very careful in ensuring safeguards that these systems are not used out of scope. So I'll leave it at that.
And I'll just come in from the operational side on why AI in the first place, why autonomous weapon systems and AI-enabled autonomous weapon systems. So if you accept the going-in argument that war is a perpetual feature of the human condition, and those who don't believe that, that's fine. It's just for the rest of us that accept that war is always going to be there. What are you trying to do? You're always trying to develop weapons that will deny, deter, and defeat your adversaries, while also minimizing the risk to your own forces and the forces of your partners and allies, and also trying to minimize the potential for civilian casualties and collateral damage. With that as the entering argument, then you're naturally going to go down this path of AI, because for anybody who's in the AI research community and in commercial industry has been shouting for years about the potential benefits of AI. Not necessarily, or in any case, talking about warfare, but you can't ignore how these things were being talked about. So naturally, militaries are going to gravitate to do anything that improves effectiveness and enhances efficiency. And at least from my view, AI is capable of improving the way we do business in militaries, everything from back office functions to undersea to outer space, cyberspace, and all points in between. So it's coming. And then what I use is generally the 3 A's. It will help augment humans. It will help accelerate doing tasks, and also will automate certain things that otherwise humans would have to do. And I saw very quickly one of the comments or questions in the chat, and this augmentation piece is extremely important. Actually, I think there's a lot more that must be done on this idea of human machine interaction, human system teaming, whatever you want to call it. We don't know quite what right looks like. I think Ron, probably more than most, having worked in the robotic side for a long time, knows what right may look like. But in terms of warfare applications and AI-enabled autonomous systems, we have to spend a lot more time thinking about what this thing is called human-machine interaction or human-machine teaming. And to go back to something Gary said earlier, war is a study in technology asymmetry. A side that gains a technology advantage likely could gain that advantage for a long period of time. I'm not saying that technology by itself will ever win or lose wars, and AI by itself will never win or lose wars. But what we're afraid of is another side getting those advantages before we can. That introduces all sorts of other international relations theory problems about security dilemmas and strategic stability, all legitimate and must be addressed. But the idea that the US will sort of tie one hand behind its back and not go down the AI-enabled autonomous weapon system path, I don't accept that, because that's not the way history plays out.
So another question is, or just something that we thought we would talk about, is intersection of law and technology, and sort of the global perspective. And also one of the questions was about, from the participants, was about defensive versus offensive systems that the people that we can be in war with may not have the perspective that we've been talking about, any kind of restraints on what they do. Where does that make it the defensive perspective more important for us, since we can't control probably what the enemies would do? Anybody want to take a crack at that, Jody?
Well, I think it's important in this conversation that we kind of distinguish what is autonomous weapon systems, in the sense that there are a lot of systems out there being used that are being called autonomous weapon systems that to me are just data analytic systems. Identifying who might be potential targets, or surveillance systems that are just intelligence gathering or regular surveillance or reconnaissance type technologies used for those purposes. And so I think that lumps a lot of things into this category that unfairly get shoved in here, and then this whole area gets tainted with lots of conclusions and opinions. And we're seeing some of that with some of the uses of technology and weapon systems in current conflicts. But it goes to to what I think Gary was alluding to with, there's a lot that gets thrown into this basket that tends to spill over and cloud the conversation. So I think that as we look at this, it's important to say, well, what is just predictive analytics? What is just an analytical, data analytics system that's being supported or used by military? I don't know if you guys, other guys have thoughts on that, but I've been concerned with some of the articles and things that have come out lately in current conflicts about what they're calling autonomous systems.
I have a few thoughts on that, and often based on a meeting with lawyers and others as well too that I had at UPenn, as I mentioned earlier, just a couple of weeks ago. And we shared the article among ourselves on the Lavender system, which is a data analysis system. It identifies potential targets in Gaza for the IDF. And it's increased the numbers from the tens to the thousands of targets. And the issue there is not whether the system is working accurately, but what the acceptance rate is for the certainty on a particular target. I would contend, though I think we discussed this, Gary, a while back, about the value of the target as well too, warranting certain use of weapons, whether it's high precision munitions or dumb bombs, which are used in Gaza as well too. But even worse, or better, I don't know, depending on your side, is the Where's Daddy system as well, which purportedly identifies when a potential target has gone home and then becomes a more likely target for engaging. You should keep in mind, again, according to IHL, it is not illegal to kill civilians, even if it's foreseen. There's a principle in ethics that has been baked into IHL called the principle of double effect, which talks about a necessary military good and an associated evil with that. And then whoever decides, and I'll like to hear Gary talk about this as well too, which is often the JAG lawyers, which determine the relative value of those things as to whether it's an acceptable engagement or not. I advocate actually Michael Walzer's approach on this, which is the principle of double intention, which does the same thing to start with, but then it actively puts a moral responsibility on the engaging party to find ways to reduce the evil effect before engaging the target. So this, and much of that article was debated as potential propaganda. The sources were questioned at that meeting as well too. From someone who had reported from Al Jazeera or something like that. Finding the truth during wartime is always a difficult task, but I would say fact or part fiction or all fiction, which I don't think it is. I believe that we need to find ways to address these issues effectively. There is technology out there, the DARPA Subterranean Challenge, which we competed in and came in second place, actually tied for first, but tiebreaker knocked us out of it, found ways to map tunnels in the environment very effectively, as opposed to bombing hospitals where the tunnels are underneath it and the like. So technology is coming, AI technology is coming, which can help with some of this. But right now, it's the humans that are using this technology which causes me pause. It's not uncommon, actually, in warfare when humans are engaged, causing me pause.
So, yeah, let me jump in on that. Certainly, at the end of the day, it's how the humans are using it. It goes back to my earlier point about distinguishing between a means of warfare, the capabilities that we employ, and how we employ them. I think there's been, at least from sort of what I'm hearing, there's been a lot of sort of myth around the systems that the Israelis may or may not be using. The base notion from a military perspective and a practical perspective, if you can identify more targets, that's a net positive, right? The whole point and logic of warfare, accepting warfare as fact, as General Shanahan mentioned earlier, is to defeat your enemy as quickly and efficiently as possible. right? It is ultimately about imposing your will through violence, and being better at that and more efficient at that, and attriting away your enemy as quickly as possible within the confines of what law allows. So the decision support systems are exactly that. They are analytical systems that are aiding the humans in making the judgments about what is a legitimate target. Have we reached a sufficient standard? And international law doesn't really set a specific standard. It's generally understood as what is reasonable for a decision maker under the circumstances in which the decision is made. How are you assessing the potential for incidental harms and risks to civilians? You've described what is part of the law of armed conflict in the precautionary principles of an obligation to do all that's feasible to minimize the incidental harm to civilians in the conduct of your attacks and operations, right? So this is all already sort of in the structure of the law of armed conflict. One point that's sort of interesting, because we've touched on the edges of Gaza, which obviously is a very emotional question for many people right now, but actually within the U.S. military, the notion that I, as the JAG officer, was tasked with making those relative value judgments within the structure and definition of what is proportionality in the law of armed conflict, right? That the anticipated incidental harm to civilians or civilian objects will be excessive in relation to the direct and concrete military advantage to be obtained by conducting an attack. That wasn't my job. That is the target engagement authority's job. That is the commander's job. My job is to review and assist the commander in making that determination and assessing whether the commander has sufficient information to make a reasonable judgment about it. Is the commander's assessment reasonable in that circumstance? The IDF is actually the only military I'm aware of where the lawyers are given the sanction and authority to veto a commander's decision in that regard.
Gary, tell him IDF.
Is the Israeli Defense Forces, right? So, generally it's not a lawyer's call directly. It's a judgment. And this is what the law of armed conflict essentially seeks to regulate, not the outcomes, but the decision-making processes that may lead to those outcomes, to ensure that they're adhering to certain standards and that they are reasonable judgments under the circumstances. And so again, it may be that if you have the technology available, failure to use it could be seen as, depending on the circumstances, not meeting your precautionary obligations. I think to some of your earlier points, Ronald, where you may be able to more accurately assess the environment, more accurately identify what is a target versus what is not a target, et cetera. And this isn't really new. If you're familiar with the collateral damage estimate methodology that the U.S. military has developed over time, has been adopted by other militaries, a lot of it is based on computer modeling. When we're assessing what we believe the incidental harms will be, to factor into the calculus of proportionality and where we will nest the risk decision-making within a chain of command, we use computer modeling. And so then you get questions of how much is a commander obligated to double second and tertiary question that computer modeling in the process, right? That's, I think, part of the issue.
Yeah, and so if I could pick up on some of the things that were just said, but take it beyond the legal aspects alone, and if I could give any assurances, and I know I'm generally speaking about Western or maybe a different term of liberal democratic countries, states that do things a certain way when it comes to weapons system. There is an awful lot that goes on behind the scenes that people on the outside don't see and I don't think appreciate, in terms of not just legal reviews, but all the other reviews you have to go through to get these systems approved for deployment. And those include things like putting hardware or software constraints or restraints in, doing policy conditions, doing procedural conditions. I can speak from very personal experience that I would have to spend a long time back in the old days of Southern Watch before we ever flew, understanding what all those rules were and what those constraints and restraints and boundaries that were put on the weapon system. And that's going to be no different for autonomous weapon systems and AI-enabled autonomous weapon systems. That's part of what DoD Directive 3000.09 says to go do, is all these different policy reviews that need to take place. That's not to say they're perfect. They're absolutely not perfect. Ron said this earlier. These systems will fail. Things will go wrong, but at least the conditions have been set. And what I said in my opening statement was, we also want to spend a lot of time on what is really different. And I know this because of Project Maven and the JAG. AI test and evaluation is different. There's a lot that looks the same as other test and evaluation of software and hardware, but there are some fundamental differences that have to be taken into account. And Gary mentioned modeling and simulation. There are other things we have to do to take a graduated approach to bring these technologies in, because I can guarantee you, as we learned all the time, no matter all that testing, modeling, and simulation you do, the first time you put it in the wild, it will do something unexpected. So how do you take that into account? But I just don't want to leave out the policy review process here, where certain systems may have to go all the way up, in the US case, to the President of the United States to agree to employ them because of the risks that might be involved in deploying those systems.
You know, I think this one way we can kind of start summarizing and all these great ideas is to look at some of the questions people are asking. And if I could do that, just some of them are a little bit long, so I'll try to capture what they're asking. But one of them was, so use of, let's see, example of defensive systems that we're talking about. Use of directed beam of laser systems to down drone swarms at a very low cost per drone downing, as per the recent attacks on Navy troops. This is a defensive AI system with human input to start and direct the system, but the targeting would be use AI. Anyway,
yeah, Larry, let me just jump on, quickly on that. Certainly from a law of war, law of armed conflict perspective, what is the most highly regulated, portion or aspect of combat operations is the use of violence. Not surprisingly, that's where the biggest risk comes. That's where the worst outcomes can happen. And so much of what we think about in terms of targeting law, the rules of distinction, proportionality, precautions that I mentioned, et cetera, are all triggered by what are considered to be acts of violence. But they're not limited to offensive actions. It's whether it's conducted in the offense or the defense. But I do think that what we've seen is, one, if you're acting in a defensive mode, the urgency generally is going to be higher, which factors into the questions of how important, what is the direct and concrete military advantage for striking something? If there's inbound missiles, if there's inbound aircraft, et cetera, the risk to your own forces is much higher. The need to act quickly is much higher. And that factors into the importance of striking the target itself. And oftentimes, I think depending on the environment you're talking about, the risks may actually be lower. And this is where we've seen use of systems that some would call autonomous in sort of the naval environment with the CWIS, et cetera. I just saw that DARPA, through a DARPA project, this may ruffle the fighter pilots' feathers on the panel, but right, they had a successful test of an AI flown fighter jet that engaged in air-to-air combat with a piloted aircraft. They didn't release the results of who won, but that is an environment where the risks are much lower, that you will have the incidental harms to civilians, et cetera, And so the risk tolerance may be different in employing a system in an environment like that. This is one of the, I think, other challenges in coming up with some specific set of rules beyond the rules that exist to regulate the use of autonomy or artificial intelligence enabled autonomy. Is context matters very much in when and where and how you're deploying the capability, you know, in different conflict contexts and environments, et cetera.
So you know what worries me so much is that it takes two to tango, and we have conflicts all over the globe right now. And our use of artificial intelligence is exploding. And we do have autonomous weapons that are being used now. And it's all a very uncertain space. So Jack, you know, you mentioned your DoD Directive 3000.09, and I know you developed that, and you said, and it is amazing. It is a very good document, but you said you were the only military in the world that has such a policy, right? And so what are the chances of other militaries using that as an example and doing something similar? We have the laws of armed conflict, which is the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Convention. So they're out there with various protocols now attached to them. And we have the Convention on conventional weapons. And so there are those hard rules of law. Then there's international customary law, and now Geneva Convention is international customary law, even if a country hasn't signed on to it. So those are just the general laws that are now deemed to be applicable to all nations. But at the beginning of that, you have these things the United States is always pushing called norms, normative frameworks, what good behavior. And those can evolve over a long time into customary law, but it takes a long time. And then we have the State Department put out this, what do they call it here? I've got it, Political Declaration on the Responsible Military Use of Artificial Intelligence and Autonomy. And 52 countries have signed on to that, but it doesn't include Russia or China or Iran or North Korea or any of the other people we would say are on the bad guys list. So with all of this technological innovation and this murky legal framework, how does anyone have any confidence that we're going to do the right thing, or that our guys aren't going to be put in a situation that's terribly disadvantageous because there isn't a legal framework?
The only thing I can offer, Jody, is that this is going to sound sort of trite, and I don't mean it to be, is nefarious countries will be nefarious countries, and they're not adhering to lots of other things. So the fact that they're not doing this would not surprise me. However, I don't want to make that a blanket statement. I think China is very serious about looking at this. And one of the things that we engage in these Track 2 dialogues about is why it's in every state's best interest to do this a certain way. Because if it doesn't work, it doesn't get the operational effects that they desire. And on the other hand, if it goes wrong, it may violate international humanitarian law and whatever their equivalent laws in their own countries. Now, does that stop people? No, but it still says you can and will be held accountable for things that happen that you didn't do correctly with these weapon systems. And I don't, I say it's the only document available publicly that's unclassified. I certainly hope others have been working on it. But what I also expect is that the United States is the vanguard on this. And we want to set sort of the bar very high. Will we always meet the high bar? Sometimes, unfortunately, we probably won't under the heat of battle. But what I don't want to ever see happen with autonomous weapon systems and AI-enabled autonomous weapon systems is setting a low bar and failing to meet that. This is my whole point about safe, lawful, and ethical use of these systems. We actually do want to enter these arguments with a very high standard and then say to everybody else, why aren't you doing this? That is, I agree with you. This is going to take a long time. It's taken a long time, and it will continue to take a long time to play this out in the court of international opinion.
I would agree with what you said, Jack. A few things, comments on what came earlier, though, as well, too, is one of the things that concerns me with this technology is the potential for rushing this technology to the battle space in the event of a severe conflict, an existential threat, conceivably, as Walzer is described as where all laws are off the table and nations may resort to total war under those circumstances. I would not like to see artificial intelligence contribute to that. Speaking to Gary's comments regarding computational models. I agree. I hope that these things will be the next generation of precision-guided munitions and can indeed assist in reducing significantly collateral damage and civilian deaths. The issue surrounding those modelers, though, it was interesting that the precursor to collateral damage fast, or CD fast, was called bug splat, which I don't know how that happened, but that was the phraseology that was used to deal with that, which was a collateral damage estimator. And they are imperfect as well, too, but they do provide guidance. They do provide guidance to the commander. And you're right, the commander ultimately makes the decision. And the commander ultimately makes the decision whether to be legal, moral, or ethical as well, too, given the information that they have. The JAG lawyer can only provide a recommendation. I agree. He doesn't, at least in our country, does not make that final decision, but he or she should be in a position to provide sound and solid, and even cases forceful advice, as conceivably where they have JAG lawyers, correct me if I'm wrong, but in many of the missions flown by unmanned aerial vehicles or uninhabited or drones, as we call them, out of Creech and other places, lawyers have been present as to whether to engage a target, but again, only in an advisory capacity as well. Getting more policy associated with this proactively, so that when these circumstances arise, we can do better than we might do if we didn't have these policies in place. I agree. I don't know whether existing IHL covers the spectrum of potential autonomous weapons. That has been a large argument as well, too, which is related to the definitional questions of what autonomous weapons potentially could be. I don't see any glaring holes right now for the kinds of weapons that we have and the procedures that the United States in particular follows for the development of these weapon systems and deployment and employment of these systems. But the technology is moving faster and faster than our ability to regulate it. And if we don't recognize that and be proactive about the use of this technology in the battle space or elsewhere, even things like self-driving cars. How are we going to ensure the safety of our people and the people worldwide? That's my concern.
Yeah, we're always in a risk of, rushing to failure, so to speak, or the pressures that come about because it is, listen, I agree, nefarious states will be nefarious states, but they are states and they're sovereign entities and they make their decisions. And we have to be able to anticipate and be able to deal with and respond to those decisions. I'll give a quick anecdote. I remember in basic training, one of the worst moments I had was when my drill sergeant dropped us and was smoking us doing push-ups with MOP 4 gear on. That's our full chemical protective gear and a gas mask on. Don't go back and tell my drill sergeant, but I may have cheated a little bit by pulling the seal on my mask so I could breathe, right? I was suffocating trying to do push-ups with this. You might ask yourself, well, why did you have that gear? We have chemical weapons bans. You're not supposed to use chemical weapons in warfare. You shouldn't doctrinally equip yourself and train yourself on the use of those protective systems. No. We don't. The law of armed conflict isn't something that tells us how the other side's going to fight, and so we can doctrinally, align ourselves. We anticipate the worst. We expect that there will be violators. That's a very different question, right? So part of it is what our expectations of what laws and norms will do, and I think what you see in the political declaration, et cetera, is an effort at leading by example, to try and put limits on on this, to try and advance this at a responsible pace and way, but also recognizing that there's simply going to be the pressures of first to market, so to speak, right? China has made this its goal of dominating this field by, I think, 2027 or whatever their marker on the wall was. We have to recognize that unlikely that our adversaries will employ this, just like how they will conduct operations generally, will necessarily be consistent with what we view as legal, moral, and ethical principles.
Do you think countries today would agree that a robotic soldier is not a person for purposes of the laws of armed conflict?
I'm not sure what it matters. I mean, can you, if there's a robotic soldier, as you say, coming, operating against my forces, I'm going to destroy it no differently than I would destroy a tank or a howitzer. It is a military capability that I need to attrit off the battlefield, just like I need to attrit off the battlefield the human soldiers that are part of the enemy's military capability.
Yeah,
If I
but we have
capture it-
rules for those. So we say they have to be in a distinctive uniform, recognizable from a distance, and under the command of someone responsible for the forces. And so there are rules about a soldier being a lawful combatant and features
We sh-
about it. So I
but-
think
but-
it does matter.
Yeah, except that the rules of passive distinction that require essentially separating yourself by uniform or symbol, that is not a war crime to not do so.
Yeah.
All it does is impact your status if you are captured. You are not entitled to prisoner of war status, assuming we're talking about an international armed conflict. Like, these are all these in-depth niceties. You lose that status eligibility, and with that, you lose the immunity from prosecution for your warlike acts. Well, if it's a robot, what difference does that make? We're not going to put robots in, I think, robot prisoner of war camps. We're going to destroy it because it's a thing, because it's a capability no different than a tank. So I
think we're verging onto the sentience aspect as well too. I do not like the phrase robot soldier. I view these machines as adjuncts to the warfighter. They will complement their place in the battle space and do things and enhance their capabilities, hopefully without violating LME principles, or legal, moral, ethical principles along the way. I think it's a bit of a red herring to start going down that road where we can imagine that thousands of robotic soldiers will be coming over the hill and engaging an enemy force. We already have bombs that can do that. Why build small robots to be able to accomplish that from a financial and effectiveness perspective as well? I really think that these are intended to help people that are already fighting the war. That's just my take on it.
Let me jump in there. I want to read some questions. I've been reading some that are anonymous. I haven't, people probably realize that when they hear the question, but at least Denning has a question that's kind of relevant here. That if the goal of having autonomous technology is reduce cognitive load on soldiers, would pre-combat training be modified in a way that lessens the need for attention to certain things in case the technology fails or other kind of things? Would anybody like to comment on how this?
Sure. Yeah, if I heard the question correctly, it's really it's an interesting question in a lot of different ways. But the point in theory is, as you get these systems, especially as they get smarter, more intelligent, and more autonomous, then you are having them do things that humans no longer have to do. And the question is, do you actually give up those human tasks, or do you kind of keep a back pocket example of things you have to do? Here's a very good one. So I started my flying days in the F-4 Phantom, a very old airplane. We carried maps around in the cockpit. We carried a map and wouldn't go anywhere without them. At some point in the F-15E, it became a digital masterpiece, and you had maps for a little while, and then we gave them up because we had an electronic map. The chances of everything failing in that there was a chance it could fail, but you didn't spend nearly as much time focusing on sort of the core old day map reading skills. I mean, no kidding. When I came in, we were doing sextant work, shooting stars. I don't know if they still do that today. It's good backup, but we move on. And I think you could make the case that in Google Maps on people's vehicles, whatever, it's a similar thing. But we always have to be concerned about, do you have enough backup skills if those things fail? This is where I would say what we want to train our people to do is do what we think humans will always do best: critical thinking, inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, and all those things that make us different, and intuition and judgment to make up the difference. And I actually remain pretty optimistic about our ability to do that when these systems fail. And inevitably they will fail. They're not all going to fail at the same time, and they will fail in different ways. But at least for the countries I know the best in their militaries, we actually have very creative, innovative, ingenious individual soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, Coast Guardmen, and civilians that know how to work around failure. So it's a great question. I just would look at it maybe a little bit differently, that you only can stuff so much into your rucksack, so to speak. So some things are going to have to come out when you get these new technologies.
Well, we've been dealing with this, as you say, sir, right? It's the same thing with land navigation. That's a skill that I learned as a basic infantryman initially. But how many soldiers today can land navigate without GPS to the same level of efficiency? And so, how much do you worry about the atrophy of core muscle movement and memory in the conduct of operations? So this is not a new question, so to speak.
Let me ask another question then from Nina Shamsi about civilian casualties. Do you feel like we're moving in a direction of improving the situation, or do autonomous weapons won't make any difference?
I think that depends on who you ask. I believe there is potential for significant reduction in civilian casualty harm. There's even a civilian harm and mitigation plan that just came out of as a consequence of the White House executive order. I don't know if that was a State Department thing or not. People are trying to find ways to indeed reduce civilian casualty. Am I optimistic? A bit. My concern is that if we create the technology, will it be used in the wrong way by humans along the way as well, too? So safeguards, or guardrails, as it's often referred to in the discussions that I've heard, need to be incorporated into these systems to make sure that they are used within scope and used by the right people in the right way. And if that is done successfully, I am less pessimistic that we can reduce I am hopeful that we can reduce the amount of civilian casualties over what exists today. It all depends on the conflict as well, too. And the conflicts are quite different from one battle space to another, but nonetheless, I believe they can help, hence the calling of the next generation of precision-guided munitions I use for these things.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that, we've seen this is a trend line over time with the introduction of PGMs, precision-guided munitions, other techniques, et cetera. I think, unfortunately, we also have to recognize that, yes, all conflicts are different and the contexts are different, but there's definitely been a greater trend toward urbanization of warfare, right? It's just the nature of the beast. And so at the same time that you can be getting better at precision, et cetera, you're going to be fighting more than likely more and more in very condensed, highly populated areas, which just increases risk.
So
Yeah, I remember one quick thing, if I may, Jody. When we first started our work in autonomous vehicles for the military, the Fulda Gap and the Russians coming across Germany was the major concern. That's quite changed now. Sorry, Jody.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to go to Jack. Jack, at your position at DOD, you did so much to help lay the groundwork and lead us into this space. And you've been a front runner in thinking about risk management with AI military systems. And I wondered if you could just talk for a minute about your risk management proposals that you've come up with.
Yeah, I'll make it short. I'll post the link into the chat, but it really comes down to the risk has been integral to this entire conversation. Every one of us has either said the word risk or implied the word risk as in these discussions. And that's what we're getting at here. There are risks in every military operation. There always have been, there always will be. For the most part, we've dealt with risk in a certain way in all other conflicts. What here I'm proposing is a risk framework, 5-tier risk framework for AI-enabled military systems, because there are things that are just different enough to come in with a different look at this. And it builds on the work by retired Indian Army Lieutenant General Ravi Panwar, some excellent work that we've built on through our combined work at the Track 2 Dialogue. And it's a 5-tier, begins on one end with excessive risks that you might call prohibited, but I prefer the term excessive, down to negligible risk, which are decision support systems that don't tie into any warfighting systems. So you start with excessive, and I would say the canonical example there is AI being used to launch nuclear weapons. That is not only an excessive risk, but I personally would call that a prohibited risk. Below that, you have it's a weapon system or a decision support system. So as a weapon system, if it's not excessive risk, then it's either high or medium risk. And then if it's a decision support system, it's some critical decision support or negligible. And in that, you sort of take that into account, but all the other things that must be taken into account in the operational environment that Gary's talked about several times. Context really matters in this. And what this is designed to do is just get a dialogue going. It provides a level of scrutiny about any given system. It's a framework, and that's an entering argument. And it kind of models after the European Union AI Act, which is a 4-tier system. But of course, the military has lots of other things to take into account. But what it will allow is commanders and policy leaders, politicians, to look at these systems individually and make some risk-based decisions about how those will be used or constrained or guided or whatever. So it's a different way of looking at the problem. It's not unusual. I think it's very typical to other risk-based framework, and a lot more needs to be done on it. But what I hope it does is, one, allow a discussion internally to countries to figure out how to use these things, but also provides a framework for discussions internationally, and to include a common risk lexicon and maybe even a risk assessment methodology that we might agree on, absent banning systems, which I don't think we are going to see anytime. So thanks, Jody, for that.
Larry,
Well,
one quick.
Adam,
Adam, can you please add that link that I gave earlier? Thank you. I just want to add to this very quickly that this was a paper, a road mapping exercise we did with significant opponents of the technology, Russell Stewart, Toby Walsh, so-called proponents, myself, Paul Shari, and others as well too, which gives a way forward, if you would. So please, if you're interested in some concrete suggestions as how to move forward, please, for those of you who are interested, take a look at that Spectrum link that was just posted. Thank you.
Ron, could we follow on with that to start our 2-minute summaries? You could just continue talking there, and the challenge is that we've got so many questions and so many participants. It's just great that this is been wonderful webinar, but we're going to try to sum up now. And so anyway, Ron, could you go ahead and try to keep the 2 minutes, and we'll go through everybody as a way.
I've said a lot, and I think I said most of what I want to say, but there are a few things I just like to reiterate. Is that I am not a proponent of weapons technology of any way, shape, or form. I think it's grossly unfortunate that we've learned very efficient and effective ways to kill each other, whether domestically or internationally. I think what I am a proponent of is finding ways to regulate this technology, since it is in existence and will continue to be in existence, in ways that will reduce harm to the innocents in the battle space. That is what I am concerned with, and I will continue to be concerned with in my work into the future.
Thank you. Gary.
Yeah, thank you. I would absolutely agree that developing ways to commit harm to others is one of the most least favorable aspects of human evolution and development. But it is a reality, unfortunately. To earlier points, efforts in the early 1900s to outlaw war obviously didn't come to fruition, and I don't think will in any time in the near future. We've talked about sort of how is this different than the technologies we've developed and incorporated in the past? I mean, I think one key aspect of it that is different is how it adapts, right? It has the capability of adapting and evolving. That puts a continued obligation, and you see this reflected in the political declaration and the different principles that are put out there in terms of testing, evaluation, monitoring, et cetera. I do think that puts a different kind of obligation on the users of the technology. So it's not sort of a fire and forget system overall, right? But with that said, and as General Shanahan has noted several times, it will make mistakes. Things will go wrong. And I think one of the really difficult questions that always comes up and surfaces is the responsibility and accountability question. We generally understand that. Jody, here's where the law is pretty clear. Those who make attack judgments that are either impermissible or reckless face accountability for that. But we also have to recognize there is not a perfect weapon system that is fielded ever. There are known error rates. Things happen. And we have to also acknowledge that just because someone, a commander who uses an AI-enabled autonomous system within the parameters for which it's certified, and it goes wrong, we have to acknowledge that maybe there's not going to be accountability there, and we're not going to bring an algorithm into the dock for a criminal trial. This is just one of the Gordian knot aspects of these discussions that I've seen over time. And then efforts to try and think about walking back the responsibility. But what about the coders? What about the developers? That's all fair to talk about, but at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that there is some inherent risk, and sometimes we have to buy risk, right? Because of balancing it against other imperatives that we have to look at. So, that's my sort of last 2 points.
Okay, and Jack?
Just to go where Ron started, there's an inevitability to these things. So we have to start really focusing on a life cycle view of these systems. And I say life cycle, I mean design, development, testing, policy, fielding, sustainment, all of that. And it's happening slowly, but it needs to accelerate. And the only other things I say, and one of them just picks up exactly what Gary was talking about, as much as I try to give everybody a reassurance that there is a discipline and a rigor to this process of weapons review, as Jody said, it doesn't happen everywhere, so there are concerns there. But as these systems get more sophisticated, I do worry about a couple of different things. One is true online learning autonomous systems that then do have some agency maybe to them, and that worries me a lot, but also emergent effects and cascading behavior, or cascading effects, emergent behavior. I said those things backwards, but we don't know enough about that yet, other than maybe in the laboratory, in the research world. We have to start thinking very seriously about what we see happens with these idea of cascading effects and emergent behavior of multiple AI-enabled systems, autonomous systems working together. But other than that, thank you.
And Jody?
Well, thank you everyone for attending this today and for your excellent questions. I know we didn't get to a lot of them. The International Committee on the Red Cross is the keeper of the laws of armed conflict, and they have come out with a position on autonomous weapon systems. They recommend that states adopt legally binding rules. As we've all noted, I think that's quite a ways away. The State Department's effort is a start, and with 50 countries, that's a good start. The ICRC wants unpredictable autonomous weapon systems expressly ruled out. They want the use of autonomous weapon systems to target human beings ruled out, and the design and use of autonomous weapon systems that would not be prohibited should be regulated. In all the things we've talked about, I think that we're on the way to addressing those goals. Certainly the DoD Directive 3000.09 is one way of looking at on the way to getting some regulation in the systems. The risk framework Jack talked about, looking at the existing rules of law, as Gary's pointed out, do provide us a framework that can address some of the things that go wrong with the use of these systems. But it's a cutting edge issue that, as we started out saying, it intersects legal, technical, and operational aspects. And it's going to continue to be a very interesting conversation. So just thank you to my fellow speakers for taking time to be here today. It's your expertise in this space that is helping pave the road. And so please stay engaged.
Well, yes, thank you for a wonderful webinar, and this will be following up with other things I hope that we'll be working on together. And just to and then thanks to all of those who participated by watching this and asking questions, and well, we need to keep at this. So just as a closing, just to remind you about the Technology Policy Council, the U.S. Technology Policy Committee in Europe, that we'd love to have you join in the work that we're doing. And there again is the information. The easiest way is send email to the address there. And with that, we thank you again, and look forward to speaking with you in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.